Late in 1916, winter did not arrive like a season. It arrived like a decision already made. There was no signal, no announcement, no command carried down the line. One morning the air felt heavier inside the lungs, as if breathing required thought. By nightfall, the cold had tightened its grip without leaving evidence of when it began. Soldiers noticed small changes first. Breath lingered longer. Mud resisted boots instead of yielding. Metal felt sharper to the touch, as though it had learned how to bite. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the danger. Armies had prepared for violence, not stillness. They trained men to advance, retreat, reload, and endure noise. They did not prepare them for long hours without movement, for darkness that pressed inward, or for silence broken only by wind scraping across open ground. Rifles were cleaned and inspected, maps studied, orders memorized. Warmth was assumed, not supplied. It existed only in memory, in the idea of home, in places no longer reachable. Winter revealed this assumption without urgency, as if it had all the time it needed. The cold did not behave like an enemy with intention. It did not rush forward or demand attention. It simply settled. Water thickened, then hardened. Fabric stiffened. Skin lost its ability to signal pain accurately. Fingers became unreliable instruments, slow to obey the mind. Boots froze from the inside, shaped by the foot one day and resisting it the next. Even weapons began to change. Oil congealed. Triggers resisted pressure. A rifle could be present in the hands and absent in function at the same time. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of expectation. Military planning treated weather as background. Something endured between decisions. Winter refused that role. It required no ammunition, no supply lines, no rest. It worked constantly, even when nothing else moved. Soldiers soon understood that strength did not matter if the body could not generate heat. Strategy meant little if joints would not bend. The battlefield expanded inward, into muscle and nerve, into sensation itself. At first, many believed it would pass quickly. Winters always had. This one felt different, not because it was colder, but because it stayed. Days blurred into one another, as light shortened and darkness arrived early, then lingered. Time slowed. Waiting became heavier than marching. The cold did not attack. It occupied. And with every hour it occupied, it claimed something small in return. Attention. Energy. Certainty. There were moments when the cold felt almost intelligent, not because it planned, but because it never stopped. Men could rest, could sleep, could lose focus. The temperature did none of these things. It remained patient and exact. Numbness crept forward quietly, first mistaken for adaptation, then recognized as loss. Fingers stopped reporting detail. Toes disappeared from awareness entirely. What could not be felt could not be protected. By the time anyone named the danger, it was already familiar. Winter had moved in without permission, and without resistance, reshaping daily life, one unnoticed change at a time. The sky had delivered it, but the ground would keep it. It was only then that many sensed something unspoken had shifted. Survival was no longer guaranteed by orders or equipment, but negotiated hour by hour. The cold asked nothing and promised nothing, yet it influenced every choice. Men found themselves listening to their bodies with new suspicion, watching the ground for signs of change, measuring nights by how long sensation lasted. Winter had not announced itself as an emergency, but as a condition, and conditions, once accepted, rarely leave quickly. That realization would follow them downward into spaces never meant to endure frozen time. Where earth replaced sky and stillness deepened, trenches were never built to last. They were carved quickly into open ground, shaped by urgency rather than foresight, meant to be temporary lines that would shift with the war. Engineers assumed movement. Command assumed rotation. Soldiers assumed that no one would be left standing in the same place long enough for the earth to matter. Winter exposed that assumption without argument. Water collected where boots had passed 100 times. It had nowhere to go. Trenches were shallow, their angles wrong for drainage, their floors uneven and soft. As temperatures dropped, pooled water thickened, then locked into place. Mud turned rigid, then expanded. Walls pressed inward. Duckboards warped, cracked, and vanished beneath ice. What had once been narrow protection became a constricting channel that resisted every step. The trench did not collapse dramatically. It failed quietly, in increments. Edges slumped. Corners buckled. A wall leaning by morning would be closer by night. The ground grew unpredictable. A man could stand safely in one spot for hours, then sink suddenly when the surface gave way beneath frozen layers. Falling was not always dangerous, standing back up often was. Movement became calculation. Too much meant drawing attention. Too little meant stiffness that could no longer be worked out. Lying down offered rest only in theory. The longer a body stayed still, the faster warmth drained away into the ground. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by shivering or the fear of not waking with sensation intact. There was no safe posture, only temporary compromise. The trench changed character. It stopped feeling like shelter and began to resemble confinement. Sound behaved differently, swallowed by packed earth and snow. Light barely reached the lower levels. Dampness seeped into fabric, into skin, into breath. Every surface felt cold because everything was cold. Even touch between men carried no comfort. It only confirmed how little heat remained. Many soldiers discovered an unsettling truth. They trusted the pattern of enemy fire more than the ground beneath their feet. Shells followed rhythm. Bullets obeyed distance. The trench had no such predictability. It shifted without warning. It trapped boots, numbed hands, forced bodies into angles they could not hold. Familiar ground became a source of constant negotiation. The most dangerous moments were ordinary ones, turning around. Adjusting equipment, passing another man in a narrow corridor. A slip could wedge a body against frozen walls long enough to panic. Panic in cold drained strength faster than effort. The trench offered no margin for error because it had never been designed to hold life in place for months. Winter revealed the truth of the trench system. It was a reaction, not a refuge. It assumed time would be short and conditions would change. When neither happened, the ground began to take ownership of the space it had been forced to give up. Earth and ice reclaimed shape, pressure, and control. As the trench stiffened and narrowed, the struggle grew more intimate. The environment could no longer be treated as background. It pressed against knees, shoulders, and ribs. The space available to endure shrank, guiding attention inward. Soon the question was no longer how to survive the trench, but how the body itself would respond to being held there. The cold amplified every flaw the designers had ignored. Drainage channels clogged, support beams split. Communication lines sagged under ice, muting messages before they reached another section. Repairs were attempted with stiff hands and limited light, each effort slowed by the very environment it tried to correct. The trench resisted improvement. Any change disturbed frozen balance and triggered new collapse. Men learned to move carefully, not to fix, but to avoid provoking the ground. The system revealed its limit. It could delay death, but not support living bodies through extended cold. What remained was endurance shaped by constraint. The longer winter held, the clearer it became that the trenches were not a neutral stage. They were participants, active and indifferent, applying pressure with every frozen hour, forcing the human body to adapt inside a space never intended to sustain it. This realization narrowed attention further, drawing focus away from structure and toward flesh, breath, and the limits waiting inside the men themselves there. The cold did not announce its damage. It introduced itself gently, almost politely, through sensations that seemed manageable at first. Toes tingled. Fingers stiffened for a few moments, then returned. Joints complained quietly, then loosened with movement. Soldiers noticed these changes and adjusted without concern. The body, they believed, was adapting. This belief allowed the cold to continue its work unnoticed. Numbness followed. It arrived unevenly, advancing and retreating in no clear pattern. A hand might feel thick and distant 1 hour, then return to normal the next. Feet stopped sending detailed messages to the brain, reporting only pressure instead of shape or temperature. Many mistook this for efficiency. Less feeling meant less discomfort. The cold seemed to be losing its edge. In reality, it was settling deeper. Thought slowed alongside sensation. Decisions took longer to form. Conversations drifted, then dissolved. Attention wandered without warning. Men found themselves staring at familiar objects without understanding why they had looked there. Fatigue became constant but unspecific. It did not feel earned by effort, nor relieved by rest. Sleep came in pieces, broken by shivering or by the simple inability to stay still long enough for the body to warm itself. Waking brought no sense of recovery, only continuation. Letters home changed in ways few noticed at the time. Sentences shortened. Details disappeared. Emotion flattened into brief reassurances. Writing required warmth in the fingers and clarity in the mind, both increasingly scarce. Some soldiers delayed responding, not because they lacked concern, but because the effort felt strangely heavy. Days passed before they realized they had meant to write at all. The body did not collapse. It eroded. Small injuries lingered longer than expected. Skin cracked, then refused to heal. Muscles lost flexibility. Balance shifted as sensation thinned, forcing men to walk carefully on surfaces they had once crossed without thought. None of this felt urgent. That was the danger. There was no single moment that demanded alarm, only accumulation. Exhaustion blurred the line between physical and mental strain. Shivering consumed energy that could not be replaced. Eating felt less effective. Hunger remained, but strength did not return. The body entered a state of quiet deficit, spending more than it received, day after day. The cold did not push harder. It did not need to. It waited. Confusion followed close behind. Men questioned their own reactions. Was the stiffness temporary? Was the numbness improving? They compared notes quietly, finding no clear pattern. Each body responded differently, making warning signs harder to identify. What one man dismissed as adaptation left another barely able to stand. Shared experience offered little clarity. Gradually, a realization took shape. Numbness was not progress, it was loss. The absence of pain did not mean safety, it meant the body had stopped signaling correctly. By the time this understanding formed, many had already adjusted their expectations downward. Being cold no longer felt like a condition to escape. It felt like the state in which everything now existed. This awareness arrived without panic. It settled instead as unease, a sense that something was being taken quietly, without resistance. Men began listening to their bodies differently, not for comfort, but for damage already done. They noticed how long it took for feeling to return, how effort yielded diminishing returns. The cold had not broken them. It had begun to wear them down, patiently, leaving behind no clear point of failure to confront, only the growing understanding that nothing inside was fully protected anymore. From a distance, the armies of 1916 appeared, vast and meticulously organized. Supply lines stretched across continents. Trains ran on schedules measured to the minute. Warehouses overflowed with rifles, shells, and uniforms stamped with official marks. This abundance created confidence. It suggested control, yet beneath that appearance was a quiet miscalculation that winter would expose without mercy. Military planning treated cold as discomfort, not danger. The assumption was old and rarely questioned. Soldiers had marched through winters before. Coats existed, fires could be lit. Weather slowed operations, but it did not threaten survival itself. What no one accounted for was immobility. Trenches demanded stillness, and stillness changed everything. A coat designed for marching lost its value when a body stopped moving. Warmth generated through effort vanished the moment effort was no longer possible. Supplies reflected this logic. Ammunition arrived in abundance, stacked neatly, protected from moisture. Weapons were prioritized, inspected, repaired, and replaced. Clothing followed behind, when it followed at all. Winter gear moved slowly through clogged systems that underestimated urgency. By the time it arrived, if it arrived, conditions had already changed. Sizes rarely matched. Materials absorbed water. Some garments assumed dry environments that no longer existed. Many soldiers received a single heavy coat, meant to trap heat while walking, not while standing in freezing mud for hours. Others were issued boots that stiffened once wet, cutting circulation rather than protecting it. Gloves were scarce. Socks were thinner than expected. Official solutions failed quietly, not because they were absent, but because they were insufficient. There was a difference few had anticipated. Improvisation filled the gap. Newspapers folded beneath uniforms. Cloth strips wrapped around feet. Extra fabric tucked wherever space allowed. Men learned quickly which materials held warmth, and which only absorbed cold. These adaptations spread not through orders, but observation. Survival knowledge moved laterally, passed between soldiers who noticed what worked and what did not. The system did not teach these lessons. Experience did. This revealed a deeper truth about preparedness. Modern armies had mastered destruction, not endurance. They could move men and weapons with precision, but they had not planned for the slow erosion of the human body in extreme conditions. Cold was still imagined as an inconvenience layered on top of war, not an active force capable of undermining everything beneath it. The illusion of readiness persisted because no single failure demanded attention. There was no dramatic shortage, no moment when supply completely disappeared. Instead, there were small inadequacies that accumulated. One wet night, one pair of boots that never dried, one coat that trapped moisture instead of heat. Each compromise seemed manageable until it became permanent. Authority could not fix what it did not fully recognize. Reports traveled upward. softened by distance and expectation. Cold injuries were described as fatigue, loss of sensation framed as temporary. The language of logistics struggled to capture the slow damage unfolding in trenches. As a result, responses remained slow and incomplete. Preparedness existed on paper. Survival happened elsewhere. It took shape in quiet decisions made without guidance, in personal adjustments repeated day after day. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Weapons could be delivered on schedule, but warmth could not. Orders could be clear, but bodies still failed. The war machine functioned, while the human inside it absorbed the consequences. As institutional support revealed its limits, responsibility narrowed. Survival shifted away from strategy rooms and supply depots and settled into individual hands. Each soldier learned that staying alive would depend less on what arrived officially and more on what could be adapted personally. The next stage of endurance would not be directed. It would be chosen, one small decision at a time. When official answers failed, survival narrowed to whatever could be found within arm's reach. Warmth became something assembled, not issued. Soldiers learned quickly that comfort was no longer a condition. It was an activity. It required effort, risk, and constant adjustment. The cold did not pause while plans were made. Decisions had to happen in motion, often without certainty of their outcome. Fires were the most obvious solution, and the most dangerous. Wood was scavenged from broken supports, shattered crates, anything not yet claimed by ice. Flames offered immediate relief, a return of sensation that bordered on pleasure. But fire carried light, smoke, and scent. It announced presence to anyone watching. Many learned to build fires low and fast, shielding them behind walls of earth, feeding them briefly before extinguishing them again. Warmth arrived in short intervals, measured carefully, never allowed to linger long enough to invite attention. Bodies themselves became resources. Shared heat mattered. Men stood closer than comfort allowed, backs pressed together, shoulders overlapping in narrow space. This was not camaraderie in the romantic sense. It was efficiency. Warmth transferred whether feelings followed or not. Sleeping arrangements changed. Where rest had once been individual, it became communal, shaped by necessity rather than preference. Proximity reduced heat loss, even as it erased privacy. Uniforms were altered quietly. Coats were layered incorrectly by regulation standards, but effectively by experience. Fabric was shifted, folded, repurposed. Some men lined garments with paper or extra cloth, trading flexibility for insulation. Others cut away soaked sections that refused to dry, sacrificing coverage to preserve circulation. Every choice involved compromise. No solution worked in all conditions, and each carried its own cost. Rules bent first, then softened. Sleeping during forbidden hours became common when exhaustion outweighed discipline. Fires were lit where orders forbade them. Routines designed for control yielded to routines designed for survival. These were not acts of rebellion, they were calculations. Being seen meant punishment or worse. Freezing meant collapse. Between the two, men selected risk that felt survivable. Warmth became communal property. It was negotiated silently, rationed without discussion. One man stepped away from the fire so another could move closer. Gloves were passed back and forth to restore circulation before being returned stiff and cold. Small gestures replaced formal systems. Cooperation emerged not from instruction, but from shared understanding that no one endured alone for long. Even these solutions carried limits. Fire could not be constant. Bodies could not always be close. Materials wore out. Improvisation demanded attention and energy already depleted. Some nights, nothing worked. The cold remained unmoved by effort, indifferent to ingenuity. On those nights, endurance meant waiting rather than solving. What stood out most was the absence of certainty. Every decision balanced warmth against exposure, relief against danger. There were no correct answers, only temporary advantages. A choice that worked once might fail the next time under slightly different conditions. Men learned not to trust routines for long. Adaptation required flexibility as much as persistence. There was no pride in these measures. No one mistook them for cleverness. They were accepted as what remained when larger systems failed. Survival became experimental, shaped by trial rather than training. Each adjustment taught something small, rarely enough to feel secure. Through all of it, the mind stayed alert, calculating constantly. The body might recover momentarily, but thought never fully rested. Warmth, when achieved, was fragile. It could vanish with a gust of wind, a shouted order, or a single wrong step. The effort to preserve it left little space for reflection. These measures kept blood moving and sensation alive, but they did not quiet the mind. Beneath every action was awareness that improvisation addressed symptoms, not cause. The cold still surrounded them, patient and exact. Even at their most resourceful, soldiers sensed a growing divide. Their bodies might endure through shared heat and fleeting fires, but something else was beginning to slip beyond protection, waiting for a colder reckoning ahead. The cold did not only settle into the body, it moved inward, quietly reshaping the way thought itself behaved. At first, the change was subtle. Time felt softer around the edges. Hours stretched without clarity, then folded back on themselves. Days no longer followed a clean sequence. Morning and night became similar states marked more by fatigue than by light. Soldiers stopped marking time because time stopped offering anything useful. Prolonged cold thinned emotion. Fear did not vanish, but it lost urgency. Anger faded first, then excitement, then anticipation. What remained was a steady, muted awareness of the present moment. Thinking ahead required energy that was already being spent elsewhere. Imagining the future felt unnecessary when the next hour demanded constant attention. Hope did not disappear suddenly. It narrowed, shrinking into something practical and small. Decision-making slowed. Choices that once felt automatic now required deliberate effort. Men hesitated before moving, not out of caution, but out of mental drag. The cold introduced pause into every action. Reaction time lengthened. Certainty softened. This was not confusion in the dramatic sense. It was dilution. Thought lost sharpness, like tools used too long without repair. Fatigue became mental as much as physical. Sleep did not restore clarity. Waking offered continuation, not renewal. Conversation shortened because focus could not be held. Silence filled the gaps without discomfort. Speaking required effort, and effort felt expensive. Many discovered that not reacting conserved strength. Indifference, once unthinkable, became functional. The cold taught restraint without instruction. It discouraged excess feeling the way it discouraged excess movement. Emotional distance formed not from trauma, but from economy. Caring deeply required warmth and energy. Both were limited, so attachment became quiet. Loss was registered, then set aside. Grief condensed into something manageable, carried without outward expression. As mental narrowing progressed, the future lost definition. Plans stopped extending beyond immediate survival. Not because soldiers lacked imagination, but because imagination offered no return. Thinking ahead introduced complexity that could not be acted upon. The present was hard enough. The cold made living linear, 1 hour following the next without variation. Tomorrow existed only as a word. This quiet resignation was the cold's most efficient effect. It demanded nothing dramatic and offered no relief. It simply waited as minds adjusted downward, trimming expectations to match conditions. There was no moment when surrender occurred. Instead, there was acceptance of limits, gradual and unspoken. Some sensed the change without naming it. They noticed fewer questions forming, fewer memories being revisited. The inner noise that once accompanied waiting softened, then disappeared. What remained was a steady readiness without anticipation. It kept them alive, but it altered something essential. Years later, some would return home intact in body, yet unfamiliar in thought. The cold had taught their minds how to endure by narrowing, and that lesson did not always reverse. Winter receded. But the habit of living without tomorrow lingered quietly, setting the stage for a deeper uncertainty still ahead. At first, winter was measured. Soldiers counted days, then marked weeks with quiet certainty, believing the cold had a shape and an end. Each morning carried the expectation that conditions might ease, that the air would soften, that effort would be rewarded. Gradually, the act of counting lost meaning. Numbers slipped away. Days blended into one another without distinction. The cold did not change, but attention toward it did. What had once demanded constant awareness became familiar enough to ignore. That familiarity was not comfort, it was something more dangerous. Urgency dissolves when suffering repeats without variation. The body adapts by lowering expectation, and the mind follows. The cold stopped feeling like an event and became environment. Shivering no longer triggered alarm. Stiffness was no longer noticed immediately. Small injuries waited longer for attention, not because they were painless, but because they felt inevitable. When discomfort becomes background, warning signals lose their authority. What once demanded action now felt like routine maintenance of an already failing system. Reaction times lengthened without drama. A numb finger was flexed later than it should have been. A frozen boot was adjusted after circulation had already faded. Pain arrived, then waited. The delay itself became normal. Men learned to endure first and respond later, reversing instincts shaped for survival. This shift did not come from bravery or resolve, it came from exhaustion. Effort felt expensive, and caution conserved energy better than urgency ever could. The cold taught patience without offering reward. Waiting replaced action, because action rarely improved conditions. Moving only led to more cold. Seeking solutions exposed limitations already known. Over time, stillness felt safer than intervention. The body learned that doing less often hurt less, at least immediately. Long-term consequences were postponed without acknowledgement. Survival narrowed into maintenance rather than defense. This quiet acceptance altered behavior in subtle ways. Men stopped scanning themselves for early signs of damage. They responded only when sensation forced attention. By then, injury had already progressed. This was not neglect born of ignorance. It was adaptation shaped by repetition. When effort produces no change, persistence weakens. The cold did not defeat urgency through fear. It dissolved it through familiarity. Eventually, urgency no longer returned on its own. It had to be summoned consciously, and often it was not. The body endured because it could, not because it was protected. This was the moment when survival became less certain, not because conditions worsened, but because alertness faded. As the need to hurry disappeared, risk increased quietly. With urgency gone, behavior shifted, preparing the ground for consequences that would unfold slowly, without resistance. In cold that never fully released its grip, injury lost its usual rhythm. A cut no longer followed a predictable path from pain to recovery. It remained. What would have closed in warmer air stayed open, responding slowly, if at all. Blisters formed, hardened, cracked and widened again with each step. None of this felt dramatic. Damage accumulated quietly, layered day upon day, becoming part of the body's landscape. Soldiers adjusted without discussion. A limp developed, then stabilized. A hand changed its grip, favoring certain fingers while others withdrew from use. Rifles were held differently. Tools were managed with caution learned through repetition. Pain never fully disappeared, but it stopped demanding attention. It became a constant signal, present enough to be acknowledged, distant enough to be ignored. The body learned to function around it. Cold stripped away recovery. Rest no longer repaired. Sleep offered only pause, not healing. Tissues that needed warmth to mend remained stiff and unresponsive. Swelling receded slowly, if at all. Infections lingered without clear boundaries. Soldiers did not always recognize deterioration, because it lacked a starting point. There was no single moment when something went wrong. Decline arrived through continuation. This created a quiet misunderstanding of injury. Casualties were expected to come from visible events, explosions, gunfire, sudden trauma. What went largely unnoticed was how many men were lost to persistence. Feet that could no longer carry weight. Hands that could no longer feel triggers accurately. Bodies that could still stand but not recover between demands. The cold did not wound once. It wounded repeatedly, then waited. Movement became negotiation. Men learned how far they could walk before strain overtook control. They memorized limits through sensation rather than instruction. When pain flared sharply, they adjusted posture. When it dulled, they continued. This produced bodies that functioned just well enough to remain present, but not well enough to improve. Survival hovered at the edge of ability. Medical attention struggled to address this kind of damage. Treatments assumed progression toward healing. What they encountered instead was stasis. Wounds neither improved nor worsened quickly. They persisted, draining strength slowly. The gap between visible injury and invisible decline widened. Records did not capture attrition measured in inches, degrees, and sensation lost over time. As weeks passed, soldiers carried injuries the way they carried equipment, redistributed to reduce strain. Some damage became familiar enough to forget, only remembered when movement failed. The body no longer signaled crisis. It signaled accommodation. This was perhaps the most dangerous change. The absence of resolution made harm feel normal. The cold transformed injury into process. It removed endpoints. There was no before and after, only continuation under pressure. Many endured not because they were unhurt, but because damage arrived slowly enough to be absorbed. By the time it could no longer be absorbed, it had already reshaped what survival meant. Bodies adapted poorly, but they adapted nonetheless, teaching men to measure endurance, not by healing, but by how much decline could be carried forward without collapse. This slow failure altered how men understood their own limits. Strength was no longer measured by bursts of effort, but by tolerance for discomfort that never resolved. Each morning required an assessment not of readiness, but of persistence. Could the body perform again despite carrying yesterday's damage forward? Pain became informational rather than urgent, a background condition consulted briefly before being dismissed. The cold encouraged this mindset by punishing excess reaction, resting too much stiffened joints. Moving too much invited deeper injury. Balance was learned instinctively, without language. Over time, the body stopped asking for repair and asked only for continuation. This created soldiers who could endure extraordinary conditions while remaining permanently diminished. Loss did not announce itself through collapse. It appeared through subtraction, range of motion shortened, sensation simplified, recovery time vanished entirely. What remained was function stripped to essentials, operating without reserve. Survival no longer meant returning to health. It meant delaying failure just long enough to remain useful. This understanding settled quietly, becoming shared knowledge without discussion. Men adjusted expectations downward, not as surrender, but as calculation. In that space, endurance replaced healing as the primary measure of success overall thereafter. At some point, survival stopped pointing forward. It no longer meant returning home, or even lasting through the war as a whole. It narrowed quietly, almost without notice, until it meant something much smaller, making it through the night, holding on until morning light returned, breathing long enough for the next change of guard. The future did not disappear, but it lost relevance. It became too distant to matter. Expectations shrank in response. Men stopped measuring endurance in months or seasons. Those units felt unrealistic, even abstract. Instead, survival was divided into manageable pieces. Hours, watches, the space between one sensation and the next. This was not despair, it was adjustment. Hope did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became practical, rather than emotional. Less about outcome, more about continuation. Questions shifted. When will this end became how long can I keep this up? The difference was subtle but profound. One question imagined escape, the other assumed persistence. The cold encouraged this framing by rewarding focus on the immediate. Planning too far ahead offered no advantage. The body demanded attention now. The environment punished distraction. Presence became a necessity, not a preference. This narrowing had benefits. Men who stopped projecting themselves into an uncertain future often lasted longer. Energy was conserved. Emotional swings softened. Disappointment lost power when expectation was removed. By reducing the scale of survival, endurance became more efficient. The present moment, though harsh, was at least real. Tomorrow was unpredictable. Now could be managed. But something was lost in the process. As goals shortened, imagination weakened. The ability to picture a different life faded through disuse. Identity thinned. Men began to define themselves less by who they were and more by what they could tolerate. Personality traits flattened into functional behaviors. Patience replaced ambition. Awareness replaced desire. Emotion followed the same compression. Joy felt impractical. Longing felt expensive. Strong feeling required energy that could not be spared. What remained was steadiness, a calm acceptance that bordered on emptiness. This was not emotional collapse, it was emotional economy. Feeling less made continuation possible. The cold shaped this mindset gently. It did not argue for it. It made alternatives inefficient. Every excess was punished. Overthinking drained strength. Hope that reached too far forward invited disappointment that could not be resolved. By focusing on the present, soldiers insulated themselves from uncertainty the way they insulated their bodies from cold. Narrowing became protection, yet the cost accumulated quietly. When life is compressed into the present for long enough, the future begins to feel unfamiliar. Even when conditions improved, some found it difficult to extend their thinking again. The habit of endurance lingered. Surviving had become a skill practiced daily, and like all skills, it left a mark on how the mind operated. Survival, redefined this way, was both achievement and loss. It preserved life by stripping away what made life expansive. The cold did not ask for surrender. It offered a bargain instead. Focus narrowly, endure steadily, and continue. Many accepted without realizing the terms. By the time they noticed what had been exchanged, adaptation had already settled in. This shift prepared the ground for what came next. As survival anchored itself firmly in the present, the mind began to drift elsewhere. Detachment followed naturally, not as defense against fear, but as consequence of prolonged narrowing. When tomorrow stops mattering, thought itself begins to thin, setting the stage for a quieter, more profound change waiting ahead. At first, the change felt like rest. Thoughts that once crowded every quiet moment began to thin, then fall away. The inner commentary that followed each action softened until it barely registered. Soldiers noticed they spoke less, not because there was nothing to say, but because words no longer felt necessary. Silence was no longer empty, it was efficient. The cold dulled curiosity in the same way it dulled sensation. Questions stopped forming, not out of despair, but because answers offered no advantage. Wonder required energy, and energy was reserved for staying upright, staying aware, staying warm. Emotion followed a similar path. Feelings flattened into a narrow range that could be managed without cost. Fear did not disappear. It lost its sharp edge. Urgency had already faded. Now even anxiety felt distant, like something remembered rather than experienced. This cognitive numbness did not arrive with collapse or confusion. There was no panic, no sudden break. It unfolded quietly, through subtraction. Fewer thoughts per hour, shorter internal sentences, longer pauses between decisions. Men found themselves watching small details without reflection, listening without response. The mind narrowed its field of focus, not by force, but by habit. Conversation thinned accordingly. Exchanges became functional. Information passed when needed and stopped there. Stories were not expanded. Jokes were rare. Silence filled space comfortably, the way cold air filled lungs without complaint. Speaking demanded more effort than it returned. Not speaking conserved strength. Over time, many began to prefer this state. Thinking hurt. It pulled attention toward conditions that could not be changed, toward futures that could not be reached. Memory introduced contrast, and contrast required emotional response. Numbness removed that friction. In its absence, the present felt smoother, more tolerable. The cold had offered something unexpected, relief from the weight of awareness. Detachment in this form was not weakness. It was adjustment. The mind learned the same lesson the body had learned earlier. Excess sensation drained reserves. Excess thought did the same. By reducing both, endurance became possible. This reframing mattered. Silence was not failure. It was strategy. There were moments when this quiet felt almost peaceful. Waiting no longer involved anticipation. Darkness no longer carried expectation. The mind rested inside a narrow band of perception, free from constant evaluation. Many accepted this willingly once they noticed how much easier it made endurance. The cost was not immediately felt. With fewer thoughts circulating, reflections slowed almost to stillness. Days passed without commentary. Decisions were made without internal debate. The mind functioned, but it did not wander. This reduced inner movement conserved energy in a way nothing else could. It allowed men to exist without constantly weighing meaning or consequence, which would have required strength no longer available. Yet something subtle shifted. With fewer thoughts circulating, memory lost its usual anchors. Events were registered without being processed. Experiences passed through the mind without settling fully. This was not forgetting in the conventional sense. It was suspension. Experiences remained present without being integrated. The silence grew familiar, then necessary. When external noise intruded, it felt abrasive. Commands, sudden movements, unexpected conversation disrupted the careful balance the mind had established. Soldiers retreated inward, not from fear, but from overload. The cold had taught their thoughts how to stay still. In this stillness, the mind survived by becoming smaller. It reduced itself to match conditions. There was no alarm in this reduction, only quiet efficiency. Thought had not vanished. It had slowed, dimmed, and stepped back. As winter deepened, this cognitive hush settled in alongside physical numbness, preparing the ground for stranger effects to follow, when memory itself would begin to shift, and time would lose its edges. Even so, this calm was fragile. It depended on sameness. Any change threatened to break concentration and return feeling all at once, which many sensed would be harder to endure than the cold itself. Time began to lose its edges long before anyone noticed it was happening. Days arrived without shape, then left without record. Morning and night still existed, but they no longer carried meaning. Light faded and returned, yet it failed to divide experience into parts. Everything felt continuous, stretched into a single state of endurance where sequence mattered less than persistence. Routines continued because routines always do. Guards were changed, rations were issued, messages were passed. But internally, the order of events slipped. Soldiers struggled to recall what had happened yesterday versus a week before. Memories formed without anchors, floating free of dates and context. The cold did not erase time directly. It blurred the markers used to track it. Fatigue played a role, but it was not the whole explanation. The mind itself adjusted. When each day repeated the same sensations, distinguishing between them felt unnecessary. Attention narrowed to function. Remembering exact moments offered no advantage. The present demanded everything, leaving little capacity for cataloguing the past. Letters from home arrived carrying warmth from another world. Familiar names appeared on paper, written in confident lines. Yet reading them felt distant, as if they described someone else's life. Faces were remembered intellectually but struggled to appear clearly in the mind. Emotion followed more slowly, muffled by cold and distance. Longing softened, not because it disappeared, but because it lost detail. Dates slipped away first, then sequences. Eventually, faces blurred at the edges. This was not a failure of memory so much as a change in its priorities. Holding on to precise detail required energy and emotional engagement. Both were costly. Forgetting reduced strain. The mind learned that vagueness hurt less than clarity. This created a strange double state. Soldiers functioned reliably in the present, while becoming unreliable witnesses to their own experience. Events were lived fully, then faded almost immediately. The past remained close enough to influence behavior, but too indistinct to provoke feeling. Memory shortened its reach. Some noticed this shift and felt unease. Others welcomed it. Without sharp recollection, suffering felt lighter. Pain still occurred, but it did not echo as strongly afterward. Loss registered, then softened. Forgetting acted as insulation, dulling emotional extremes, the same way cold dulled sensation in the body. Time itself became flexible. A night felt endless while lasting no longer than any other. Weeks disappeared without leaving impression. Waiting lost structure, anticipation faded. The future appeared as an abstract continuation rather than a destination. In this state, endurance became easier because comparison vanished. There was no better time to contrast with the present. The cold encouraged this quiet editing. It did not force memory away. It made remembering inefficient. The mind responded by simplifying. Details were stripped back. Only what was immediately useful remained accessible. Everything else drifted, unanchored. This was not confusion. It was coherence of a different kind. By loosening grip on time, soldiers reduced mental friction. They remained alert without being burdened by accumulation. Each moment stood alone, lightly connected to the next. As memory softened, identity followed. Without a strong sense of before or after, life narrowed into function. This shift did not feel alarming. It felt calm. The cold shaped perception gently, guiding thought away from complexity. In this altered state, the mind protected itself by releasing what hurt. Forgetting became a form of care, and as memory blurred, emotional ties began to lose definition as well, setting the stage for a quieter separation still to come. This state lingered even when moments of clarity returned. Brief recollections surfaced unexpectedly, then faded again, leaving behind a sense of dislocation rather than insight. Soldiers learned not to chase these fragments. Doing so reopened emotional weight that no longer fit their narrowed lives. Instead, they allowed memory to pass through lightly, unheld. This acceptance reduced friction and preserved balance. Time continued moving, but it no longer pulled attention with it. By releasing sequence and detail, the mind found a way to remain steady inside prolonged uncertainty, preparing itself for an even deeper withdrawal that would soon follow. What came next would feel quieter still, as emotional connection weakened and survival turned inward, beyond time, memory, or expectation entirely, without comfort or guidance. Its withdrawal was not sudden. Emotion did not break or disappear. It stepped back quietly, as if recognizing it was no longer needed. Bonds between men remained, but they changed texture. Concern became practical. Care was expressed through action rather than words. A hand steadied a shoulder. Rations were shared without comment. A space was made near warmth. These gestures carried meaning without requiring explanation. Conversation felt unnecessary, even intrusive. The cold had reduced communication to what preserved function, and emotion followed the same rule. Feeling deeply demanded energy and attention. Both were in short supply. The mind learned to ration them carefully, offering just enough connection to maintain cooperation, never enough to invite vulnerability. Grief changed form under these conditions. It did not vanish, but it shortened. Loss was registered quickly, acknowledged briefly, then set aside. Not because it lacked importance, but because dwelling on it offered no advantage. The cold made repetition of pain inefficient. Each emotional response required warmth that could not be produced. Empathy, once effortless, became heavy. To feel another's suffering clearly meant reopening one's own. Many sensed this cost instinctively and adjusted. They helped without asking questions. They noticed absence without naming it. Emotional distance was not cruelty, it was conservation. In a landscape where every resource mattered, restraint preserved endurance. Over time, emotional retreat became habit. Men learned how close to stand, how much to say, how little to reveal. Relationships flattened into dependable routines. Trust existed without intimacy. Care functioned without warmth. This narrowing reduced friction. Arguments faded. Expectations dissolved. The absence of emotional peaks made endurance steadier. Yet beneath this calm lay something unresolved. Humanity was not destroyed, but suspended, feeling weighted behind a thin wall of restraint, held there intentionally. Many sensed that allowing it forward again would demand strength they no longer possessed, so they kept distance, even from themselves. This withdrawal carried an unspoken logic. When emotion receded, survival became quieter and more predictable. There were fewer internal disruptions, fewer moments of overwhelm. The cold rewarded this stillness. It punished excess feeling the same way it punished excess movement. Over time, detachment felt safer than engagement. Soldiers remained capable of kindness, but kindness no longer required exposure. It was performed without self-reference. The person giving help disappeared into the act itself. In this way, endurance continued without drawing attention inward. By the end of the winter, this emotional economy felt normal. Loss was anticipated before it occurred, softening its impact. Bonds existed without demand. Shared experience required no commentary. Men lived beside one another with quiet coordination, each respecting the invisible boundaries that kept feeling manageable. This suspended humanity allowed survival to continue, but it also delayed reckoning. Emotion held back did not vanish, it waited. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with stillness. Something essential had been set aside to endure the cold. What remained afterward would not be immediately visible. The cost would emerge later when warmth returned and restraint was no longer required. Within this quiet state, the cold achieved its most subtle victory. It reshaped not only behavior, but inner permission. Men gave themselves approval to feel less, to ask less of the world and of one another. This choice was rarely conscious, yet deeply consistent. Survival improved as expectation diminished. The body endured because the mind stopped demanding meaning from suffering. This did not feel tragic in the moment. It felt efficient. Only later would the weight of what had been postponed become clear. For now, humanity hovered, thinned, but intact, waiting for conditions to change. And as winter continued, that waiting became the most natural response of all. It was enough to remain present, enough to endure quietly, enough to set aside complexity until later. Winter demanded this narrowing, and the mind complied. What followed would reveal whether what had been preserved could ever be fully returned again in gentler time. Spring announced itself quietly, through movement rather than sound. Ice loosened its hold and water began to travel again, dripping from trench walls in steady threads. Ground softened, then surrendered. Boots that had once rested on frozen certainty sank into mud with each step. On paper, this was improvement. The cold had receded. The environment was changing. Yet among the men who had endured winter's stillness, relief did not arrive with the thaw. They had learned how to survive without motion. Bodies had been trained to conserve heat through restraint, minds taught to accept sameness. Now the thaw demanded movement again, and movement felt dangerous. Slipping replaced stiffness. Unstable ground introduced new risk. Standing still had once threatened freezing. Now it threatened sinking. Every step required attention that exhaustion had already claimed. Familiar habits no longer applied, and new ones had not yet formed. As the ice released its grip, it also released what it had been holding. Pain returned abruptly. Sensation flooded back into areas long ignored, bringing sharp reminders of damage concealed by numbness. Joints protested. Skin burned, limbs throbbed without warning. Injuries that had remained dormant through cold exposure suddenly demanded recognition. Winter had preserved more than it destroyed. Its absence exposed what had been quietly accumulating beneath the surface. The ground revealed its own decay. Wood that had seemed solid splintered, supports shifted. The trench floor, once locked in place, collapsed into uneven channels of wet earth. Water pooled where ice had kept shape. Rot emerged where freezing had slowed it. The thaw did not create new problems so much as reveal existing ones all at once, without pause. This sudden return of sensation confused expectation. Men had imagined warmth as comfort, motion as freedom. Instead, the body felt unfamiliar. Movement required recalibration. Muscles responded unpredictably. Balance felt altered. Even walking demanded caution. The rhythm of endurance had been disrupted, and the body did not immediately know how to replace it. Emotion followed suit. Spirits did not rise with the temperature. The absence of cold removed a structure that had shaped daily effort. Without it, uncertainty widened. Survival had been defined clearly under winter's pressure. Now the rules were changing again, without guidance. This produced unease rather than relief. Improvement carried obligation. It required response. Many found themselves missing the clarity of limitation. The thaw carried a final revelation. Winter had been holding things together through compression. It slowed decay by immobilizing it. When that pressure lifted, deterioration advanced quickly. Healing did not begin automatically. Recovery demanded resources already depleted. Survival had continued, but repair had been postponed, not completed. As conditions shifted, soldiers faced an unfamiliar task. They had to relearn how to move through a world that no longer punished stillness and no longer rewarded numbness. Each step forward revealed how much had changed beneath the surface. The thaw did not mark an end, it marked exposure, and exposure required adjustment, patience, and a different kind of endurance entirely. Men moved cautiously, aware that improvement demanded participation. Nothing repaired itself without motion, and motion now carried consequence. The thaw asked questions winter never required answers for, exposing limits that endurance had concealed. Some resisted change, clinging to habits shaped by ice, while others tested new movements slowly, as if learning an unfamiliar language. Progress felt tentative. Each small gain carried reminders of cost. This period did not feel like recovery, it felt like negotiation. Survival had altered the body's expectations, and relief required unlearning as much as healing. Warmth returned unevenly, bringing clarity without comfort. What remained was uncertainty, carried forward, shaping the next phase of endurance, where survival would be tested not by cold alone, but by the body's ability to respond to change after long restraint. That challenge lingered, unresolved, reminding survivors that adaptation never ends and that relief can be as demanding as the conditions that preceded it for many lives. As the cold loosened its grip, blood began to move differently. It returned to places it had avoided for months, flowing into fingers, toes, joints that had survived on the bare minimum. With it came sensation, not gentle at first, but insistent. Pins and needles flared, then spread. Fingers ached as though waking from a long compression. Feet struggled to interpret the ground beneath them, uncertain how much weight they could bear. What had once been absent now arrived all at once, demanding attention. Pain sharpened beyond expectation. Memory had softened it, but the body did not forget. Sensation returned without patience, revealing what numbness had concealed. Joints protested with every movement. Muscles tightened unpredictably. Some welcomed this intensity. Pain meant presence. It confirmed that the body still responded, that circulation had not abandoned them entirely. For others, it inspired quiet fear. Each new ache hinted at damage that would not fade with warmth alone. Small moments revealed the scale of adjustment required. Hands trembled while striking a match. Fingers fumbled with simple tasks once performed automatically. Lighting a cigarette demanded focus, not habit. Balance felt altered. Standing too long brought waves of discomfort that demanded sitting again. The body, once trained to minimize sensation, now had to relearn how to interpret it. Numbness, it became clear, had been a shield. It had dulled not only pain, but awareness of limitation. Without it, endurance felt heavier. Every step carried feedback. Every motion reminded the mind of what the body had carried through the winter. The cold had reduced sensation to preserve function. Its absence restored sensation, but made function harder to maintain. Recovery did not feel like reward, it felt like effort. Sensation required management, attention, recalibration. Men learned again how far they could push before pain demanded retreat. The threshold had shifted, but no one could define it clearly. Each body responded differently. What felt tolerable one day felt overwhelming the next. This return of feeling altered posture and movement. Soldiers adjusted how they walked, how they held tools, how they rested. They paused more often, not out of weakness, but necessity. Ignoring sensation now carried greater cost. Pain demanded response in a way numbness never had. The body reasserted itself, no longer content to operate in the background. Emotion followed sensation in subtle ways, pain invited awareness, and awareness brought thought. The body could no longer be endured without acknowledgement. For some, this was grounding. For others, it was exhausting. Endurance had been simpler when sensation was muted. Now survival required engagement at every level. There was no uniform response. Some leaned into sensation, testing limits carefully. Others avoided it, moving as little as possible, hoping the body would recalibrate on its own. Neither approach offered certainty. Recovery unfolded unevenly, without clear milestones. The body had adapted to cold by reducing input. Reversing that adaptation proved complex. Pain reconnected present movement with past damage. Each ache hinted at the months that had shaped it. Recovery did not erase that history, it revealed it. This phase demanded patience of a different kind. Men had endured winter by narrowing experience. Now they were asked to widen it again, slowly, carefully, without guidance. Sensation forced attention outward, but also inward, toward limits long ignored. As bodies relearned how to feel, the mind began to stir from its long restraint. Awareness expanded, carrying both discomfort and clarity. It marked a transition into another form, where pain replaced numbness and presence replaced absence. What followed would depend not only on how the body adjusted, but on how the mind would respond to sensation after so much silence. As sensation returned to the body, thought followed slowly behind it. Not all at once, and not with clarity, but with presence. The inner silence that had made endurance possible began to thin. The mind, once reduced to function, reopened space it had not visited in months. This return did not feel like relief. Awareness brought unease. There was no new danger, no immediate threat, yet something felt unsettled. Soldiers noticed moments of stillness filling with reflection instead of rest. Waiting no longer meant simply enduring time. It meant being alone with memory. Thoughts replayed fragments without sequence. Images surfaced, then faded, leaving behind impressions without explanation. The mind was active again, but unsure where to place what it found. Many struggled to describe what they had endured, even privately. Language felt inadequate. The experience of winter had not been organized into stories. It had been lived moment by moment, without commentary. Now, with distance returning, the absence of narrative became apparent. Unease grew not from fear, but from uncertainty about what meaning, if any, could be drawn. A quiet realization began to take shape. Winter had narrowed life enough to make it manageable. With fewer thoughts, fewer emotions, fewer expectations, endurance had felt linear. Now that narrowing loosened. Awareness expanded in all directions, and with it came complexity. Survival no longer followed a simple rhythm, it demanded interpretation. This widening felt disorienting. Men accustomed to reduced interactivity found themselves distracted by memory, unsettled by possibility. The future reappeared, but without clarity. It no longer felt abstract, it felt undefined. Thinking ahead required imagination, long unused. Some avoided it, others attempted it cautiously, only to retreat when uncertainty overwhelmed. The contrast between then and now deepened the unease. Under winter's pressure, there had been little room for doubt. Each day followed from necessity. Now necessity had softened, leaving space that demanded choice. Choice required confidence the cold had slowly eroded. Reflection exposed how much had changed internally, even when outward conditions improved. Group dynamics shifted as well. Silence took on new meaning. Where it had once felt efficient, it now felt charged. Shared experience no longer guaranteed shared understanding. Some spoke cautiously, testing words before releasing them. Others withdrew, sensing that speaking too clearly might unlock emotions not easily contained. The return of thought revealed distance between individuals who had endured side by side. This phase did not announce itself as crisis. It unfolded gradually, through restlessness, through lingering questions, through moments of clarity followed by confusion. The mind searched for orientation, but found no simple markers. The habits that had preserved survival under cold no longer aligned with changing conditions. Winter's restraint had simplified existence. Its absence exposed layers that endurance had hidden. Awareness widened, and with it came recognition of cost, not as regret but as understanding. Survival had succeeded, but it had not preserved everything. The return of thought marked a transition rather than a conclusion. It signaled that endurance alone was no longer enough. Meaning had been deferred, not resolved. Now it pressed gently, persistently, without answers. The mind adjusted again, learning how to hold both survival and reflection at once. As awareness returned, soldiers began carrying winter forward in subtler ways. It had shaped how they thought, what they questioned, and what they avoided. This internal imprint would not fade with warmer air. It moved with them, settling into habits and expectations. With the thaw complete, the story shifted from environment to legacy, from what winter demanded to what it left behind within those who endured it. The cold loosened, then left, but the habits it shaped remained. Even as temperatures rose and conditions stabilized, bodies continued to behave as if winter still pressed in from all sides. Warmth was treated as temporary. Rest was approached with suspicion. Comfort felt fragile, something that could be lost without warning. Soldiers noticed these behaviors without fully recognizing them as habits. They felt natural, even necessary, long after their original purpose had passed. Men continued to conserve heat instinctively. Coats stayed on longer than required. Gloves were worn even when hands sweated beneath them. Standing near sources of warmth became automatic, regardless of actual need. Rest, once scarce, was now available. But it felt unfamiliar. Lying down fully, relaxing muscles, surrendering alertness seemed unsafe. The body resisted it. Vigilance had become default. These habits were not reinforced by fear, but by repetition. Endurance had rewritten instinct. The body no longer trusted ease. It expected interruption, exposure, demand. Even in quieter moments, tension lingered beneath the surface, a readiness without object. Muscles remained set. Breathing stayed shallow. The nervous system behaved as though threat remained constant, even when evidence suggested otherwise. This persistence was subtle. Soldiers did not announce it or discuss it openly. They simply continued to operate as they had learned to operate. Comfort felt excessive. Warmth felt uncertain. Moments of ease were used cautiously, rationed like any other resource. The cold had taught them that abundance could vanish quickly, and the lesson remained active. Sleep reflected this change. Even when conditions allowed rest, sleep stayed light. Waking came quickly at minor sounds. The body no longer trusted stillness as safe. This was not anxiety in a dramatic sense. It was preparedness ingrained through long exposure. The mind did not need to remember winter consciously to obey its rules. This revealed something important. Trauma did not always announce itself through memory or emotion. Sometimes it persisted as routine, as posture, as reflex. The cold did not leave behind constant recollection. It left behind a way of moving through the world that no longer required thought. Survival had become habit, and habits resist revision. Some noticed this disconnect gradually. They realized they were bracing for discomfort that did not arrive, preparing for loss that never came. Others noticed nothing at all. Their behavior felt normal because it had become normal. Endurance had shaped baseline expectation. This affected how they occupied space. Men positioned themselves near exits. They monitored temperature changes unconsciously. They adjusted clothing preemptively. None of this felt irrational from the inside. It felt efficient. It minimized risk. What it also did was prevent ease from settling fully. Even moments meant for recovery carried faint strain. Relaxation felt like exposure. Enjoyment felt temporary. The cold had not only threatened the body, it had taught it to anticipate deprivation as default. That anticipation did not dissolve simply because conditions improved. As these habits persisted, they began influencing interactions. Relationships adapted to this quiet vigilance. The internal change did not remain internal for long. It shaped how men stood together, how they spoke, how much they revealed. The cold, though gone from the air, remained present in the way they inhabited their lives. This stage of endurance was not marked by suffering, but by carryover. Survival continued even when it was no longer required. Habits outlived necessity, and instinct lagged behind reality. The body had learned its lessons too well. And as those habits quietly shaped behavior, they also began reshaping connection, preparing the ground for another consequence. Winter had left behind. During winter, closeness had been unavoidable. Bodies shared space, heat, silence. Endurance depended on proximity and quiet coordination. Survival was collective, not sentimental. When conditions changed, that closeness loosened, and something unexpected followed. A bond forged by shared hardship did not deepen. It thinned. Conversations that once came easily began to stall. Men stood beside one another, without knowing what to say. Familiar faces carried experiences that felt oddly inaccessible. What had been lived together resisted being revisited together. Words seemed too small. Silence returned. But now it felt different. Less efficient. More uncertain. Surviving the same conditions did not produce identical inner landscapes. Each person had adapted differently, retreated in different ways, preserved different parts of themselves. The winter had demanded endurance, not agreement. When the pressure lifted, those differences surfaced. Shared suffering did not guarantee shared understanding. Attempts to speak often dissolved halfway through. One sentence carried too much weight. Another felt inaccurate. Experiences did not translate cleanly into language, especially not for those who had learned to survive without naming what they felt. The habits that made winter tolerable made communication afterward difficult. A subtle realization emerged. Winter had created a private language of endurance, spoken through timing, restraint, and silence. It was understood instinctively in the trenches, where context filled the gaps words could not. Outside that environment, the language lost its grammar. Gestures no longer carried the same meaning. Silence was no longer shared by default. This created distance not through conflict, but through mismatch. Men recognized something familiar in one another, yet could not access it directly. The bond remained, but it was no longer active. It rested beneath the surface, unspoken and untested. Attempts to revive it often felt intrusive. Loneliness followed quietly, not the loneliness of isolation, but of unbridgeable familiarity, being surrounded by those who understood part of the experience, but not all of it. Each carried winter differently, and comparison offered little comfort. Differences were not failures, they were consequences. Some responded by withdrawing further. Others filled the space with routine or humor, avoiding depth altogether. These adaptations reduced friction, but widened emotional distance. The shared past became something acknowledged without exploration, a nod instead of a conversation, recognition without engagement. What made this distance difficult was its invisibility. Nothing had gone wrong in a visible way. There were no arguments, no betrayals, just a quiet sense that what had once bound people tightly no longer functioned the same way. The cold had required closeness. Its absence revealed divergence. This disconnection did not negate the bond formed under pressure. It complicated it. The relationship existed without language, without a clear role in the present. Some felt it as loss. Others accepted it as change. Few could explain it without discomfort. Winter had synchronized behavior without synchronizing emotion. When survival required sameness, differences were irrelevant. When survival loosened, differences became apparent. The result was not separation, but spacing. A respectful distance shaped by recognition of limits. As these bonds shifted, the experience of winter moved from shared endurance to private memory. What had once been held together began dispersing inward. This dispersion would soon meet a larger response, not from individuals, but from systems. The next stage of the story widened its focus, asking how institutions attempted to contain and understand what could not easily be spoken or shared afterward. Winter altered the war quietly, without issuing commands or drawing maps. It interfered with plans already approved, schedules already written, movements already calculated. Armies discovered that strategy assumed stability the environment could not guarantee. Timelines slipped not because of resistance, but because cold changed what bodies and machines could do. What had been designed on paper met conditions that did not negotiate. Commanders began to recognize that weather could no longer be treated as scenery. Extreme cold slowed supply movement, limited visibility, restricted communication, and reshaped terrain faster than engineering could respond. Trenches collapsed or froze into unusable shapes. Roads vanished beneath mud or ice. Even the most carefully planned advance could stall without enemy interference. Winter introduced delay as a constant presence rather than an exception. This forced a recalibration of expectations. Operations were shortened, postponed, or abandoned entirely based on forecasts, rather than opposition. Decision-making became reactive to temperature as much as intelligence. The environment asserted itself as an active variable, not a passive backdrop. In doing so, it exposed an uncomfortable truth. Modern warfare depended heavily on assumptions of control. Technology offered power but required conditions. Weapons malfunctioned. Vehicles failed. Systems designed for efficiency lost reliability. Cold did not destroy these tools. It reduced their predictability. Armies that had trusted precision confronted limitation. Nature ignored hierarchy, training, and rank. It applied pressure evenly and without intention. The realization arrived gradually. There was no single doctrine rewritten overnight. Instead, adjustments accumulated. Winter gear received new attention. Rotations were reconsidered. Fortifications accounted for drainage and insulation where possible. These responses acknowledged the problem without fully solving it. Adaptation lagged behind experience. The most significant change was conceptual. Weather was no longer a variable to endure between battles. It was a force capable of shaping outcome. Campaigns succeeded, or failed, not only through human decisions, but through alignment with conditions beyond control. This reframing challenged narratives of inevitability and progress. Victory no longer appeared purely technical. Yet the lessons remained incomplete. Cold was recognized, but often only in relation to logistics and movement. Its psychological effects were less visible and harder to quantify. The long-term consequences carried by soldiers did not translate easily into strategy manuals or planning tables. What winter altered internally resisted documentation. When the war moved on and seasons changed, many of these insights softened. Attention shifted back to technology, tactics, and command. Nature resumed its role as background in historical summaries. The fragility winter had revealed faded from focus, surviving more clearly in bodies than in records. Still, something fundamental had shifted. Extreme cold had demonstrated that modern systems were not self-sufficient. They required alignment with forces that could not be commanded. This understanding lingered beneath subsequent planning, shaping caution in ways rarely stated outright. The war was not undone by weather, but it was reshaped by it. Winter pressed quietly against confidence and exposed limits that could not be ignored entirely. Its influence did not end with thaw or ceasefire. It extended forward, carried by those who endured it, into lives that would unfold far from trenches. The longest consequences were not strategic, but human, waiting beyond the battlefield. These lessons resurfaced unevenly in later conflicts, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes ignored. Planners referenced climate, yet still trusted adaptation would be quick. The memory of frozen trenches softened with time, reduced to cautionary notes, rather than central concerns. What winter had proven about endurance, vulnerability, and delay resisted full integration. Systems improved, but assumptions endured. The gap between preparedness and reality remained, waiting for conditions severe enough to reopen it. In this way, weather left a lasting imprint without becoming a permanent teacher. Its influence was felt indirectly, through hesitation and adjustment, rather than doctrine. And so winter's shadow stretched forward, subtle and persistent, shaping decisions quietly, while remaining officially unspoken, long after the war ended. Leaving the front did not feel like an ending. Trains rolled away from the lines slowly, carrying bodies east and west through landscapes that looked untouched by months of frozen stillness. Roads opened into towns where shop windows stood intact and water still flowed freely. On the surface, this was return. Distance increased with every mile. The ground changed, the noise faded. Yet inside, nothing loosened. The body recognized movement, but the mind remained where winter had trained it to stay. Warm rooms felt unfamiliar, almost staged. Heat pressed against skin too evenly, too generously. Many found themselves opening windows without thinking, letting cold air in as if balance required it. Stillness, once a threat, now felt dangerous in a different way. Without constant demand, attention drifted. Muscles tightened in quiet rooms. Sleep stayed shallow, alert to sounds that no longer mattered. Home offered comfort that felt unreliable. Beds were soft in ways the body did not trust. Silence stretched without purpose. In the trenches, suffering had structure. Endurance followed patterns. Here, difficulty lacked form. There was no clear task to occupy the mind, no schedule enforced by necessity. The absence of pressure did not create ease. It created space, and space invited uncertainty. Many felt less safe away from the front than they had felt within it. That realization arrived without logic. Trenches had been dangerous, but predictable. Each day followed a rhythm shaped by survival. At home, unpredictability took a quieter form. The mind scanned constantly, searching for signals that were no longer present. Vigilance remained active without object. The body prepared for threats that never arrived. Routine felt foreign. Simple choices carried unexpected weight. When to sleep, where to sit, how long to rest. These decisions, once dictated by circumstance, now demanded intention. Intention required confidence. Confidence had thinned during winter. Men hesitated, not because they lacked desire, but because options felt strangely exposed. Conversation revealed the gap between appearance and experience. Others saw return. Soldiers felt continuation. Survival had followed them out of the trenches, refusing to dissolve with distance. It showed itself in posture, in habit, in attention that never fully settled. The cold had ended physically, but mentally it lingered, shaping response long after sensation faded. Movement away from the front did not produce separation from the patterns learned there. Trains carried bodies, not instincts. The body left first. The mind lagged behind, repeating winter's rules in places that no longer required them. Warmth still felt temporary. Quiet still felt unsafe. Comfort still felt conditional. This displacement unfolded without drama. There were no outbursts, no clear moments of crisis. Just a steady sense of misalignment. The world looked familiar, but behaved differently. Survival no longer demanded constant effort, yet effort remained. Men waited for hardship to announce itself again. unsure what to do in its absence. The war zone receded, but winter remained close. It had taught the mind how to endure pressure, not how to release it. Leaving the trenches did not include instructions for letting go. That absence marked the beginning of a new challenge. As home failed to provide relief, attention turned inward. Memory, long suppressed, began to stir, and with it, a quieter struggle took shape. This lingering unease did not feel like danger, yet it carried weight. Days passed with an undercurrent of waiting, as if something essential had been misplaced during the journey back. Men noticed how difficult it was to relax into ordinary life. Laughter felt sudden, calm felt unfamiliar. Even moments of safety seemed provisional, as though they required justification. The cold had given purpose to vigilance. Without it, vigilance turned inward. What followed was not immediate pain, but tension without release, a sense that survival had not ended, only changed its location, moving quietly into memory and thought, preparing to surface in ways no one yet understood over time and circumstance alone. When soldiers returned, questions arrived before they were ready. Families asked how it was. Communities leaned forward, waiting for stories shaped like beginnings and endings. There was expectation in those questions, but also distance. Words hovered, ready to be used, yet none of them felt right. Experience had not arranged itself into something speakable. Winter had been lived through the body, not organized through language. Translating it felt intrusive, as if naming it might reopen sensations that had barely settled. Silence offered protection. It functioned the way thick fabric once had, insulating what remained sensitive beneath the surface. Speaking required reaching back into cold spaces the mind had learned to seal. Silence allowed those seals to hold. Many did not forget winter at all. They remembered it constantly. What they avoided was shaping it into sentences. Language felt too sharp for something that had been endured without commentary. When words did surface, they felt thin. Descriptions sounded inaccurate, even to the one speaking. How could a sentence carry months of stillness, fatigue, and adaptation? How could language express the quiet pressure of endurance without making it seem trivial or exaggerated? Rather than risk distortion, many chose restraint. Silence felt more honest than approximation. This restraint spread naturally. Households adjusted without discussion. Conversations shifted towards safer subjects. Gaps appeared where stories were expected, and those gaps were rarely pressed. People sensed that something unapproachable lived there. Silence became shared, not enforced. It settled into routine, shaping how families interacted. Questions softened. Listening changed. What was not said carried as much meaning as what was among those who had endured together. Silence functioned similarly. They recognized it without explanation. No one demanded articulation. Shared experience removed the need. Winter had taught them that not everything required expression to be understood. Silence preserved that understanding without exposing it. This absence of speech was not emptiness. It was active. It filtered what entered awareness. Speaking would have required revisiting vulnerability, and vulnerability felt unnecessary now. Survival had demanded restraint. Silence continued it. Communities learned around this silence, not through instruction, but observation. Veterans spoke less about the past, and more about the immediate present. Emphasis shifted to routine, work repetition. Life was rebuilt through action, rather than reflection. The cold had ended, but its habits remained intact. This silence was not without cost, but it was chosen knowingly. It allowed stability to return slowly. It kept memory contained. Winter did not need to be retold to remain real. It lived in posture, in habit, in absence. Words risked changing its shape. Silence preserved it as it was. In the quiet of ordinary days, memory did not disappear. It surfaced without invitation. A smell, a draft, a moment of stillness would bring it forward. These moments were private, processed internally without explanation. Silence ensured they passed without disruption. Expression would have demanded response from others not prepared to receive it. Over time, silence became identity. It replaced uniform and routine as a marker of who had endured and how. It did not announce itself, but it was recognized. Winter remained present, not as story, but as condition. As silence settled outward, something else happened inward. Without language to frame memory, recollection behaved differently. It appeared in fragments, images, sensations. These private returns became the next terrain of endurance, shaping what survival meant. After the war had ended, night changed after winter. Sleep no longer arrived as a clean break from awareness. It felt shallow, conditional, as though the mind never fully stepped away. When dreams came, they did not resemble memories the way people expected them to. There were no battles replayed, no explosions, no frantic motion. Instead, there was stillness. Endless waiting. Cold space without edges. Many woke with the sensation of breath frosting. Even in warm rooms, the body reacted before thought could intervene, tightening as if exposed. Blankets felt both present and insufficient. Limbs were heavy, resistant, slow to respond. For a few seconds, sometimes longer, movement felt impossible, as though sleep had carried the rules of winter forward into the night. These dreams were quiet. That was what unsettled most. They lacked narrative. No beginning, no resolution, just standing, just waiting, just cold. Fear, when it appeared at all, was distant, softened by repetition. Numbness replaced panic. The mind replayed endurance rather than danger. Many expected dreams to bring relief through expression, a way to release what had been held back. Instead, they repeated absence. Scenes without people, landscapes without detail, trenches without sound. It was not violence that returned, but atmosphere. The mind did not remember events. It remembered conditions. This absence revealed something important. Winter had trained memory differently. Instead of storing moments, it stored states. Cold, stillness, pressure. These states resurfaced during sleep because sleep removed the controls that kept them contained during waking hours. Silence maintained deliberately during the day, dissolved at night. Waking from these dreams did not bring clarity. It brought residue, a heaviness that lingered without explanation. The day began already shaped by something unspoken. Many learned to accept this pattern without analysis. Searching for meaning felt unnecessary. The dreams followed their own rhythm and resisted interpretation. What stood out was what did not appear. Combat rarely entered these nights. The enemy was absent. There was no threat to react to, no choice to make. Only endurance, stretched thin and endless. The war, it seemed, had left behind noise, but winter had left behind emptiness. This reinforced a quiet truth. The most enduring enemy had not shouted or struck. It had waited. It had occupied time and attention until resistance became adaptation. Dreams echoed this lesson faithfully, returning without urgency or intent, repeating conditions rather than conflicts. These nightly returns followed no schedule that could be predicted, yet they felt patterned. They arrived in cycles, sometimes closely spaced, sometimes absent for weeks. Their unpredictability mirrored winter itself. One night calm, the next disrupted. Memory had learned this rhythm during months of exposure and carried it forward intact. Some tried to fight these dreams by forcing wakefulness. Others leaned into sleep, trusting exhaustion to overpower thought. Neither approach guaranteed relief. The dreams did not feel hostile. They felt neutral, inevitable. Another continuation of something that had never truly ended. Over time, many stopped discussing them entirely. Dreams resisted description as much as winter had. Words flattened them, made them seem smaller than they felt. So they remained private, experienced alone and released without comment. Silence extended into sleep. As winter settled more firmly into memory, it no longer needed physical cold to return. The mind supplied everything necessary. Night became its own landscape, where absence repeated itself without effort. And as these dreams continued, they pointed beyond individual experience toward a larger question. Not what winter was, but how it would be remembered, or whether it would be remembered at all. When wars are remembered, they are remembered loudly. History favors moments that can be dated, mapped, and named. Offensives are recorded. Victories are measured. Losses are counted. What unfolds between those moments is often reduced to background, treated as pause rather than substance. Months of waiting, freezing, and enduring slip quietly into margins, if they appear at all. Cold resists storytelling. It has no face, no flag, no clear moment of arrival or defeat. It does not charge forward or retreat. It does not offer a climax. Winter settles, persists, and withdraws without ceremony. This makes it difficult to frame within narratives built around action and decision. There is no single hour historians can circle and declare that suffering peaked. Endurance does not announce itself the way violence does. As a result, the record favors what interrupts time rather than what fills it. Battles compress experience into moments that can be summarized. Endurance stretches experience until it resists summary. Freezing days blur together. Waiting produces no decisive outcome. Survival leaves no obvious marker to carve into stone. What cannot be marked easily is often left unmarked. This absence is not deliberate erasure. It is structural. Historical memory depends on evidence that can be organized, compared, and taught. Cold leaves little behind that fits those requirements. It shapes bodies, habits, and perception rather than borders and treaties. Its consequences unfold privately and unevenly, difficult to aggregate. so it fades from the record, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked definition. Winter becomes a sentence, sometimes a paragraph. The emphasis returns quickly to campaigns and commanders, to decisions that appear to drive outcomes. Endurance appears only as context, a condition rather than an experience. The human cost of waiting in frozen stillness rarely receives the same attention as the human cost of combat. This selective memory shapes understanding. It suggests that wars are decided primarily through movement and confrontation, while the long stretches of survival that make those moments possible remain invisible. It implies that what cannot be celebrated heroically matters less. The cold does not reward courage in obvious ways. It demands patience, restraint, and acceptance. These qualities do not fit easily into heroic frameworks. Suffering that leaves no monument is easily forgotten. There are memorials to battles, to fallen units, to decisive victories. There are few to months spent numb, waiting, conserving strength just to remain present. Endurance does not demand recognition. It continues whether it is witnessed or not. That quiet persistence is part of why it fades from collective memory. Yet this omission carries consequence. By focusing on action, history risks misunderstanding what war requires of those who live within it. It overemphasizes moments of choice and underrepresents conditions that shape those choices long before they are made. The cold did not decide outcomes on its own, but it altered what was possible. Ignoring that distorts the story. Noticing what is absent does not diminish what is recorded. Battles mattered, decisions mattered, but so did the months spent enduring conditions that eroded strength and reshaped thought. The absence of cold from dominant narratives does not reflect insignificance. It reflects limitation in how memory is structured. When attention shifts away from monuments and toward lived experience, a different history begins to appear, one less dramatic, but no less real. This opens space for another form of remembrance, one that survives without records, carried forward quietly by those who endured it. Some things carried forward without being named. When winter receded and records turned elsewhere, endurance did not dissolve. It slipped quietly into daily behavior, settling into lives without announcement. No document tracked it, no ceremony marked it. It simply continued, reshaped. Hands tucked into pockets before temperature dropped. Windows opened briefly in heated rooms. Food saved instinctively. Rest approached cautiously. These gestures looked ordinary, even mundane. Yet they carried memory without story. Survival knowledge, learned under pressure, persisted as reflex long after pressure had lifted. Aversion followed habit. Some avoided cold air without knowing why. Others preferred layers even in warmth. Certain sounds, drafts, or stillness triggered discomfort without clear source. These reactions were rarely questioned. They became part of personality. The cold had been internalized so thoroughly it no longer required recollection to exert influence. Emotional restraint traveled the same path. Many learned to feel quietly, to limit expression, to keep responses measured. This was often mistaken for temperament, calm, reserve, reliability. What appeared as character was sometimes adaptation. Endurance had trained emotion to conserve energy, and that economy remained useful in ordinary life. Families noticed patterns without understanding origins. Children observed caution, thrift, silence, without context. These behaviors transmitted subtly, shaped by imitation rather than instruction. No one explained them as legacy. They felt natural. In this way, winter extended itself across generations, without visibility. Endurance does not vanish. It disperses. It spreads thinly, becoming difficult to isolate, impossible to attribute. It lives in posture, pacing, expectation. It shapes how people respond to stress, how they prepare for loss, how they measure comfort. It becomes temperament rather than testimony. This dispersal protected endurance from erosion. What remained unnamed could not be challenged or corrected. It blended seamlessly into ordinary life. The cost was subtle. Behaviors shaped by extreme conditions persisted where they were no longer required. Yet they provided structure, predictability, readiness. Many lived entire lives without realizing why certain patterns felt necessary. History rarely notices this form of survival. It lacks dates and locations. Yet it influences how societies behave long after events conclude. It shapes caution. It informs hesitation. It tempers confidence. Endurance, once learned, leaves residue. This residue does not demand recognition. It functions quietly, shaping response without claiming credit. Those who carry it may never speak of its origin, may never connect habit to hardship. The influence remains regardless. Winter taught lessons that did not expire with the season. Looking closely, these quiet legacies appear everywhere, in how discomfort is tolerated, in how loss is anticipated, in how effort is rationed even when abundance exists. These traits seem personal until their pattern is recognized. The endurance that outlasted recognition did not need monuments. It required continuity. It persisted by becoming invisible, woven into lives that moved forward without ceremony. And as these traces spread outward across time, they lead toward a final question, not about what was survived, but about what survival itself becomes when it no longer has a name. It endures quietly in gestures that feel reasonable, justified, sensible. People prepare for hardship that never arrives, storing emotional distance as precaution. They expect loss before it appears, reducing surprise at the cost of joy. This posture offers stability, yet narrows possibility. It keeps life manageable by lowering expectation, echoing lessons learned in cold silence. Communities shaped by such endurance value restraint and reliability. They praise toughness, admire composure, and mistrust excess. These values appear cultural, yet originate in private adaptation carried outward. Over time, the origin fades, leaving behavior without explanation. Endurance becomes tradition without memory. In this way, the cold survives beyond season and place, influencing lives far removed from frozen trenches. Its legacy remains subtle, shaping response to uncertainty, patience under pressure, and the belief that comfort is temporary. This inherited caution rarely announces itself as fear. It presents as wisdom, yet it asks quietly whether survival must always require reduction. As these dispersed traces continue shaping lives unnoticed, they invite reflection on what is preserved and what is surrendered when endurance becomes ordinary. That final question lingers, unresolved, guiding attention toward meaning, balance, and what endurance ultimately costs over time ahead. Winter does not need to be remembered to leave instruction behind. It does not ask for ceremony or preservation. It teaches simply by being endured. Long after it passes, its lessons remain active, shaping assumptions about what can be planned, controlled, or trusted. The cold did not explain itself. It demonstrated. What it revealed first were limits. Limits of preparation. Limits of confidence. Limits of systems built on the belief that conditions remain stable long enough for solutions to work. Plans assumed predictability. Winter removed it. Not violently, but thoroughly. Strategies weakened not through opposition, but through exposure to conditions that did not respond to intent. The lesson was clear without being stated. Control is fragile. Resilience was also reframed. It was not the dramatic kind, built on courage in moments of decision. It was quiet, repetitive, unspectacular. Endurance required subtraction rather than escalation. Feeling less, expecting less, moving less. The cold taught that survival often depends not on strength, but on tolerance. That lesson resisted heroic framing. It unfolded through compliance, patience, and adjustment. Certainty suffered most. Assumptions about progress, improvement, and mastery dissolved under prolonged exposure. Each day that continued unchanged weakened confidence that effort alone would alter outcome. The cold did not argue against will. It demonstrated how easily will could be rendered irrelevant by conditions. This understanding settled slowly, reshaping expectation without announcement. The most revealing aspect of Winter's instruction was its indifference to memory. It did not require acknowledgement to remain influential. It did not demand that lessons be articulated or passed down formally. It embedded them instead, altering how bodies responded, how minds anticipated, how systems approached risk. What mattered was not remembrance, but adjustment. In this way, Winter functioned less like an event and more like a teacher that never stayed for the lesson review. It left behind altered perception rather than stories. Those who endured it did not always remember details, but they remembered restraint. They remembered how quickly stability could vanish. They remembered that conditions, once shifted, might not return quickly or cleanly. The final twist lies here. The cold did not need to be recorded to be effective. It did not seek recognition. It demonstrated how little is required to unravel control, how thin the margin is between order and adaptation. That demonstration stood on its own, complete without documentation. This reframing changes how the winter is understood. Not as background to greater events, not as tragedy or triumph, but as instruction delivered without commentary. It taught humility through exposure. It showed that endurance is not always empowering. Sometimes it narrows life in ways that persist. These lessons did not resolve neatly when winter ended. They carried forward, shaping behavior and expectation long after temperature rose. They influenced caution, skepticism, and preparedness. They lingered quietly, resurfacing whenever conditions shifted or certainty was tested. In this sense, winter remains present without being recalled. It continues to inform reactions to uncertainty, tolerance for discomfort, and mistrust of excess confidence. The lesson is not consciously applied. It is lived. As the story approaches its close, nothing more needs to happen. The cold has already done its work. It has shown what it needed to show. Meaning does not arrive through summary or conclusion. It settles through recognition. The final chapter will not resolve winter. It will sit with what remains after it, in stillness, in acceptance, where endurance no longer demands effort, and memory no longer demands explanation, where the lesson exists without insisting on interpretation. Many soldiers left winter looking whole. There were no missing limbs, no bandages that demanded attention, no visible markers that suggested damage. They walked without assistance. They worked, they spoke when spoken to. From the outside, they appeared intact. This created an assumption that survival had been clean, that endurance had passed through them without residue. The truth was quieter. Something pressed inward, constant but difficult to name. Fatigue lingered without cause, arriving even on days that required little effort. Rest did not restore. Sleep ended without resolution. The body functioned, yet never fully released tension. Muscles remained braced. Attention stayed alert. The nervous system behaved as if it were still waiting for winter to return. This wait did not announce itself through pain. It appeared through restraint. Movements were economical, reactions measured. Joy arrived briefly and left early. Laughter felt sudden, then quickly contained. None of this felt alarming. It felt sensible. Endurance had trained the body and mind to avoid excess. And that training remained active functionality masked cost. Because life continued, the assumption followed that nothing significant had been taken. But endurance does not always destroy. Sometimes it compresses. It folds stress inward and distributes it evenly, making it difficult to isolate. The result is not collapse, but carrying. Many found they could not fully relax into safety. Even in quiet spaces, attention remained partially engaged. The absence of threat did not produce ease. It produced waiting. This readiness had once been useful. Now it persisted without instruction. The body remembered conditions long after they had changed. This form of survival resisted explanation. There were no symptoms that demanded treatment, no language that captured the experience without exaggeration. Those who carried this weight often dismissed it themselves. They compared their condition to visible injury and found no justification for complaint. Strength became silence. Function replaced articulation. Yet this persistence came at a cost. Constant readiness drained energy slowly. Emotional restraint limited range. Life continued, but with reduced bandwidth. Possibility narrowed. Comfort felt conditional. The world was approached cautiously, as though stability required justification. This was endurance's hidden legacy. It preserved life by teaching the body how to operate under pressure, but it did not instruct it how to release that pressure afterward. The skills that enabled survival became habits that restricted ease. This duality was difficult to reconcile. What saved them also weighed on them. The absence of scars made recognition difficult. Others looked for signs and found none. Society associated damage with visibility. If harm could not be seen, it was assumed not to exist. Those who endured learned to accept this quietly. Their survival did not fit familiar categories. It sat between injury and health, functional yet altered. This forced a re-evaluation of what it meant to be unharmed. Survival did not guarantee return. It ensured continuation, often with adjustment. The cost was carried internally, distributed across routine, posture, expectation. Endurance had not failed. It had succeeded on its own terms, preserving life at the expense of lightness. As time passed, this weight became part of normal experience. It did not fade quickly, it blended into personality. Calmness was mistaken for resilience. Restraint mistaken for maturity. The distinction mattered less than the reality. Survivors lived with an invisible burden that neither demanded attention nor allowed release. Acknowledging this cost did not diminish endurance. It clarified it. Survival had not left scars, but it had left pressure, steady and quiet. Recognizing this reality reframed what it meant to have made it through winter. The next challenge lay not in carrying the weight, but in understanding why few around them noticed it at all. The cold left behind experiences that refused to arrange themselves into stories. It had not produced moments sharp enough to retell easily, nor scenes dramatic enough to demand repetition. There were no single hours that could stand in for months of endurance. What remained was something continuous, quiet and difficult to separate into parts. When survivors tried to speak about it, they found language thinning under the weight of what it was asked to carry. The problem was not avoidance, it was precision. How does one describe waiting so long that time loses meaning? How can stillness be narrated without turning it into something it was not? Words depend on contrast, on change, on movement. Winter had offered none of these. It had been uniform, persistent, and exact. Translating that experience into speech felt inaccurate from the start. Many defaulted to understatement. They said it was cold. They said it was unpleasant. Some used humor, framing suffering lightly, as though reducing scale might preserve honesty. Others chose silence, not because they forgot, but because anything spoken sounded incomplete. Each attempt seemed to flatten experience, reducing something vast into sentences that felt too small. Language failed not through absence, but limitation. It could name pain, but not accumulation. It could describe injury, but not erosion. It could recall events, but winter had been condition rather than event. This made articulation feel misleading, even disrespectful to what had been endured. Saying less felt closer to truth than saying more. This failure of language had consequence. What could not be expressed clearly could not be shared widely. Stories shape memory, and memories that resist story lose space in public consciousness. Cold endured without narrative slipped quietly out of record, replaced by moments easier to summarize. Battles could be dated, orders could be quoted, waiting could not. Survivors noticed this gap even as they participated in it. They sensed that what had affected them most deeply was what they least knew how to communicate. This produced a subtle isolation. Experience remained vivid internally while becoming faint externally. Others listened politely, then moved on, not out of disregard, but because nothing recognizable had been offered to hold on to. Suffering that resists description is easily set aside, not deliberately, but structurally. Institutions preserve what can be recorded. Communities repeat what can be retold. Winter's impact resisted both. It lingered privately, influential yet undocumented. The absence of language did not mean the absence of memory. It meant memory operated without validation. Those who carried it did not receive acknowledgement, not because others doubted them, but because no shared vocabulary existed to recognize what had happened. Silence filled the gap where explanation could not reach. This silence was not empty. It was shaped by effort to protect accuracy. Better to say nothing than to misrepresent something that had already taken enough. Many chose restraint over distortion. In doing so, they allowed experience to fade from collective awareness while remaining intact within themselves. Over time, this pattern repeated. What could not be named receded. What could not be summarized lost attention. Extreme cold, endured patiently and without spectacle, slipped into obscurity. It did not vanish because it lacked importance, but because it lacked language that fit public expectation. This reveals something larger about memory itself. It depends not only on what is experienced, but on what can be expressed. When expression fails, endurance reshapes life quietly instead, altering values rather than stories. And as language fell short, something else took its place, guiding behavior without explanation, preparing the ground for changes that would appear not as memory, but as orientation. After the cold, the world no longer felt calibrated the same way. Ordinary discomfort seemed softened, almost unreal. Weather that drew complaint from others registered as manageable. Conditions that once would have provoked concern now barely registered. This was not toughness in the heroic sense, it was comparison. Extreme cold had reset internal scales, and everything afterward was measured against it. Comfort, when it appeared, felt excessive. Warmth arrived all at once and lingered longer than expected. Soft beds, steady heat, abundant food created a strange tension rather than relief. These conditions felt temporary, almost indulgent. The body waited for them to end. The mind searched for the hidden cost. Ease did not feel natural, it felt provisional. Hardship, by contrast, felt familiar. Difficulty carried structure, it offered something known. Many veterans tolerated conditions others avoided without noticing the difference. Long hours, physical strain, discomfort were absorbed quietly, not as challenges, but as baseline. This tolerance was rarely framed as strength. It was simply what felt normal. Risk assessment shifted alongside comfort. Danger no longer announced itself clearly. Minor hazards appeared insignificant when compared to months spent frozen and waiting. At the same time, subtle risks were taken seriously. Small changes in environment, tone, or stability triggered attention. The cold had taught vigilance towards slow accumulation rather than sudden threat. This made the world feel uneven, with some dangers amplified and others diminished. What redefined enough was not deprivation, but endurance. Survivors learned how little was required to continue. Heat did not need to be constant. Safety did not need to be complete. Certainty did not need to exist. Once these lessons settled, expectations adjusted downward without conscious decision. Satisfaction became minimal. Excess felt unnecessary. This recalibration did not announce itself. It emerged through behavior. People noticed veterans declining comfort they were offered, choosing simplicity without explanation. They remained composed in situations others found stressful, yet uneasy in moments meant to feel easy. The internal balance had shifted. What once felt extreme now felt adequate. This created subtle distance between survivors and those who had not shared the experience. Values no longer aligned precisely. What others considered hardship felt manageable. What others sought for reassurance felt irrelevant. This was not judgment. It was orientation shaped by experience. The cold had compressed life into essentials. That compression lingered. Even when conditions improved, the internal sense of proportion remained altered. Survivors measured effort, reward, and risk differently. They required less to feel secure, but also found less pleasure in abundance. The world appeared exaggerated at the edges. This shift persisted because it was useful. It reduced disappointment. It minimized shock. Lower expectations softened impact. Life felt more predictable when little was expected from it. The cost of this adaptation was subtle but lasting. Joy arrived muted. Comfort felt suspicious. Risk felt inconsistent. What endured was not memory of cold, but its calibration. A quiet adjustment of scale that followed survivors into decisions, relationships, and daily choices. They did not carry winter as story. They carried it as measurement. This reframing prepared the way for stillness rather than resolution. There was nothing left to overcome, nothing left to prove. Endurance had already done its work. What followed was acceptance, not victory. The final movement of the story does not seek conclusion, because the cold did not offer one. It altered balance and withdrew, leaving behind a world that felt permanently tilted. With values reshaped and expectations narrowed, survival no longer demanded constant effort. It became background, absorbed into ordinary life. And as that quiet endurance settled, the story moved toward its final stillness, where nothing more needed to be carried, endured, or explained. The trenches no longer froze. Seasons passed with ordinary rhythm, winters arriving and leaving without ceremony. Nothing demanded attention, the way it once had. No ice locked the ground into silence. No breath lingered like smoke that could not escape. The absence felt clean, almost empty, and that emptiness carried its own weight. What had once required constant awareness now existed only as outline. Behavior retained faint traces. Hands still searched for pockets. Bodies still positioned themselves toward warmth. Rest was accepted cautiously. These gestures appeared small, easily explained, yet they pointed backward towards something no longer present. The cold had withdrawn, but it had not been erased. This was the realization that arrived slowly. Some experiences confirm themselves only after they end. While winter endured, attention was consumed by survival. There was no space to observe its shape or consequence. Only when pressure lifted did its imprint become visible. The mind noticed what remained when effort stopped. Absence became evidence. The fact that vigilance no longer had an object revealed that vigilance had once been necessary. Calm rooms felt spacious because tension had once filled them. Ordinary winters felt insignificant because an earlier one had demanded everything. Comparison existed even when memory did not. Life was approached differently, more carefully, because conditions had once been unforgiving. The legacy of the cold did not live in recollection. It lived in posture, in pacing, in expectation. It appeared in restraint practiced without reason, in patience that arrived without instruction. People waited before trusting ease. They prepared for difficulty, even when none was visible. These responses carried no names. They were simply how life was lived afterward. Memory did not replay winter continuously. In many cases, it faded. Sensations dulled, yet behavior persisted. This distinction mattered. What remained influential was not the event, but the adjustment it produced. The cold reshaped approach, rather than recall. It altered orientation, rather than story. In this way, the absence became quieter than remembrance, but more reliable. The lack of freezing trenches did not erase their influence. It revealed it through contrast. Stability felt temporary because instability had once dominated. Abundance felt uncertain because scarcity had once been total. The present was measured against an unseen past. This realization carried no drama. It did not arrive as revelation, but recognition. People noticed they were different without needing to explain why. They sensed limits without remembering how they were learned. The cold did not demand to be remembered. It had already taught what it needed to teach. As time moved forward, the outlines softened further. Behaviors blended into culture. Caution became wisdom. Restraint became maturity. Few connected these traits to a season long gone, yet the connection remained. Absence proved presence by shaping what followed. Standing in places that no longer froze, survivors felt nothing unusual. And that normality was the point. The cold had disappeared, and in doing so it confirmed itself. What once pressed constantly no longer needed to be seen to be known. Its reality lived on not in frozen ground, but in how ground was trusted afterward. This quiet aftermath widened the view beyond individual lives. It suggested something about humanity itself. When extreme conditions recede, what remains is not victory, but orientation. People carry forward lessons they did not consciously learn, applying them to situations far removed from the original pressure. In this way, absence teaches as effectively as presence. The cold mattered not because it was remembered, but because it changed how certainty was treated. Control felt provisional, patience felt necessary, endurance felt familiar. Even generations later, these patterns resurfaced whenever stability wavered. The lesson endured, quiet and unclaimed, shaping response without demanding belief. It asked no agreement, only adaptation. And in that simplicity, its influence remained intact long after the ice had gone, and silence returned everywhere else again, quietly without ceremony or resolution at all times thereafter. Extreme cold stripped life down to what could not be removed. Technology slowed, then failed. Planning bent, then broke. Confidence thinned until it offered no shelter at all. What remained was not strength in any familiar sense, but tolerance. The ability to remain present inside narrowing conditions. The cold did not reward force. It ignored it. Human survival, under these conditions, did not resemble conquest. There was no victory to claim, no moment when endurance overcame the environment. Instead, there was adjustment. People learned to occupy smaller spaces within themselves. They reduced expectation. They lowered demand. They allowed life to contract rather than resist contraction. This was not defeat. It was realism shaped by exposure. Strength suggested opposition. Tolerance required accommodation. The difference mattered. The cold revealed that pushing harder often produced no improvement. Effort, without alignment, drained energy faster than it achieved change. Those who endured longest were rarely the strongest. They were the most adaptable. They learned when to stop pressing and when to wait. This reframed resilience entirely. Resilience was not endless. It did not expand indefinitely with will alone. It adapted to conditions by reshaping itself. When conditions narrowed, resilience narrowed with them. This was not weakness. It was efficiency. Survival depended on learning how little could be carried forward without collapse. The cold offered constant instruction. Not through hardship alone, but through repetition. Each unchanged day reinforced the same lesson. Control is conditional. Preparation has limits. Confidence depends on circumstances that can vanish quickly. These truths did not arrive as ideas. They arrived as experience. There was no pride in this learning. No triumph in discovery. It unfolded quietly, without ceremony. People endured because there was nothing else to do. They survived by accepting what could not be altered and adapting to what could. This acceptance did not feel philosophical. It felt practical. The cold also revealed how narrow the margin of endurance truly is. Small shifts in condition produced outsized effects. A degree of temperature, an hour without movement, a moment of inattention. Survival hinged on details rather than grand effort. This fragile balance challenged assumptions about human robustness. People were not unbreakable. They were conditional. Yet within those conditions, endurance persisted. Not as domination, but as presence. People stayed. They continued. They adapted behavior until it fit the environment closely enough to remain functional. This was negotiation rather than victory, a continuous recalibration of effort and expectation. This understanding invites humility. Humans did not master the cold. They learned to exist inside it for a time. They did not overcome limits. They discovered them. The environment remained unchanged. People adjusted instead. This reframing changes how survival is understood. Endurance is not proof of superiority. It is evidence of alignment. When conditions narrow, life narrows with them. Survival does not require expansion. It requires fit. The cold was not defeated. It withdrew. Conditions shifted. What remained was the knowledge carried forward, not as memory of suffering, but as recognition of limit. Resilience had worked because it adapted, not because it resisted endlessly. This lesson holds beyond winter. It applies wherever conditions exceed preparation, where certainty collapses, where control proves temporary. Endurance succeeds not through pride, but through willingness to adjust scale. As the story nears its end, there is no conclusion to draw. Only observation. Extreme cold revealed what survival actually asks. Not heroism, not mastery, presence, patience, adjustment. A quiet agreement with reality as it is rather than as it is hoped to be. With limits acknowledged, nothing more needs to be proven. Survival has already spoken through those who endured it. The final movement does not add meaning. It allows what has already been shown to settle gently without insistence. Nothing announces the end. There is no signal to confirm that endurance has finished its work. Life simply continues, quietly, without needing permission. Winters arrive and pass again, colder some years, softer others. Yet none demand the same attention. People move through them without preparation beyond habit, without awareness of how much has already been learned. The cold no longer stands apart. It has been absorbed. Days resume their ordinary patterns. Morning light returns when expected. Streets fill and empty. Hands reach instinctively for pockets even when air is mild. The body remembers without effort. It does not require memory to guide it. What once demanded vigilance now lives beneath notice. Shaping, posture, timing, restraint. Survival fades into normalcy not through forgetting, but through integration. Endurance dissolves into routine. It becomes the way one waits, the way one rests, the way one accepts discomfort without comment. What was once extraordinary now feels unremarkable. The cold has already finished teaching. It does not need repetition. Silence returns, not as defense, but as space. The urge to explain fades. Experience no longer presses for articulation. Life moves forward without accounting. Winter becomes one season among many, indistinguishable in memory, yet present in behavior. The ground does not freeze the same way, but it is walked with caution learned long ago. There is relief in this quiet continuation. Not the relief of resolution, but of release. Effort no longer needs to be measured. The body no longer prepares for what does not arrive. And yet preparedness remains subtle and steady. Endurance does not disappear. It settles. What mattered most did not leave records. It did not survive as story or lesson. It survived as orientation, as an internal adjustment that aligned life with uncertainty. Comfort is approached carefully. Stability is appreciated without expectation. Nothing is assumed permanent. These are not conclusions. They are conditions. The cold no longer needs to be named. Naming would add distance where none is required. Its presence has already shaped response. It has altered the pace at which people move through difficulty and ease. It has taught restraint without instruction, patience without praise. Life does not return to what it was before. It becomes something quieter, more measured, less urgent. There is no longing for the intensity of survival, no desire to repeat it. What remains is acceptance of limitation and continuity. Seasons pass, bodies age, adaptation continues. Endurance, once necessary, becomes invisible. It is no longer carried consciously. It flows forward naturally, embedded in gesture and expectation. People live inside it without noticing. This is how survival completes itself, not through recognition, but through disappearance. There is no need for resolution. Nothing waits to be explained. The experience has already moved on, leaving behind only what could be kept. The rest dissolves without loss. Stillness fills the space where effort once lived. The story does not end because there is nowhere to go. It settles because it has arrived. Not at meaning, but at balance. Nothing more needs to happen. Life continues, shaped quietly by what it has passed through, carrying forward lessons that no longer demand attention. The cold has withdrawn fully now, leaving behind a way of being that no longer questions its origin. And in that stillness, endurance rests.